The helicopter bucked like a wild animal as tracer rounds stitched across the night sky. Sergeant Jessica Hawley gripped her harness, knuckles bone-white, as the bird lurched violently left. The pilot's voice cracked through Cum's calm, but strained. "We've lost hydraulics brace." The impact came an instant later, a bone-shattering collision that slammed Hawley against the bulkhead. Metal screamed, rotors shredded rock, and fire erupted in a shower of sparks. The mountains swallowed them whole, silence following the explosion like the world itself had exhaled. Hale's lungs burned. She blinked through smoke, ears ringing, ribs stabbing every breath. Instinct screamed, "Move." She dragged herself out of the twisted fuselage, boots skidding on loose shale. The air reeked of fuel and scorched rubber. Flames chewed the wreck, painting the night in a hellish glow. A body sprawled nearby one of hers. Private Rains. Neck bent at an angle, no man survived. She forced herself to look away. Counting survivors kept her sane. 3 still breathing. 2 gone. The pilot was slumped over, chest unmoving. The others groaned, bleeding, half-conscious. Hall staggered toward them, but headlights crested the ridge. Enemy trucks. Her heart seized. They had minutes, maybe seconds. Armed men spilled from the vehicles, rifles raised, voices barking in Dari. Hawley crouched behind burning wreckage, pressing her body into shadow. Her teammates screamed as fighters dragged them out, kicking, punching, disarming. One begged for mercy. A muzzle flash ended his plea. Hale's nails dug into dirt. Every instinct screamed to act, to fire back, but she had nothing, no rifle, no cover, no strength left. She would have joined the dead before saving anyone. The insurgents laughed, tossing bodies aside. One man pointed toward the smoke, shouting orders. They were searching. Hawley swallowed panic, pressing deeper under torn plating, heat blistering her skin. A boot scraped inches from her face. She held her breath until her vision blurred. Finally, the men moved on, loading captives into trucks. Engines roared, then faded into the distance, leaving the valley in eerie silence. Only the dead remained. Hawley crawled out, chest heaving, coughing black smoke. Blood slicked her temple. She checked her side 3 ribs cracked, maybe broken. She could taste copper. Around her, flames consumed the wreck, ammunition cooking off with sharp cracks. She staggered to her knees. Command would see the fire on satellite feed, maybe send drones. But not fast enough. By the time reinforcements arrived, she'd either be gone or taken. She limped toward the ridge, every step agony. Her mind flicked through survival drills, distance from crash site, water priority, concealment before dawn. But the faces of her team intruded, especially Captain Torres, dragged away, defiant even as fists slammed his skull. The image seared itself into her brain. She'd seen men captured before. Few came back alive. Those who did came back broken. Hawley paused, chest heaving, wind biting through shredded fabric. She was alone. Command would mark her as KIA, unrecoverable. Her mother would get a folded flag, another soldier lost in the dust. But she wasn't dead. Not yet. Memories clawed at her. The Michigan woods where her father taught her to hunt. The weeks at ranger school where she pushed past limits. The nights deployed when she swore she'd protect her brothers, no matter what. That oath rang louder than the pain in her ribs. Hawley sat on a rock, staring into the burning wreckage. She could hide in the mountains, wait days for a rescue that might never come. She could vanish into the desert and maybe survive long enough to reach a border. That was the logical choice. But as flames flickered, reflecting in her eyes, she felt rage swallow fear. They thought she was gone, another casualty. Her team thought she was dead, just another name on a wall. The enemy thought they'd won, dragging Americans away like trophies. She clenched her jaw, blood crusting her lip. No, she wouldn't fade. She wouldn't wait. If rescue wasn't coming, she'd make her own. If death was inevitable, she'd make sure she dragged every last bastard with her into the grave. Behind enemy lines, broken and alone, Jessica Hall made her choice. She was going to fight back. Moonlight glinted off scattered shards of rotor blade and scorched metal as Halle moved silently down the rocky ridge. Her ribs screamed with each step, every breath a dagger in her chest. She pressed herself flat against a boulder, listening. The valley below lay quiet, almost serene, but she knew the stillness was deceptive. Enemy trucks had vanished beyond the canyon bend, but there would be patrols soon. She had to move before they circled back. Her hands searched the wreckage, finding what she could. A half-broken AK lying beneath a melted console, 2 magazines with just enough rounds to make each shot count, and a dented canteen with sloshing water that smelled faintly metallic. She checked the contents. Half a pack of rations, a medkit already chewed by the crash, bandages torn and insufficient. Not ideal, but better than nothing. Halle took inventory and tested her AK. Its metal was warm from the fire, but the action cycled. It would do. She packed it carefully, slinging it over her shoulder. The next step, survival and reconnaissance. There was no rescue, no helicopter waiting at the base of the ridge. Only her, the desert, and a mission she hadn't yet formally chosen, but one that had begun. Hours crawled by. Halle kept low, moving only in short bursts, using boulders, ridges, and shadows as cover. She memorized every sound, every flicker of movement. 2 figures moved in the distance, patrolling the valley floor. Halle froze, letting the cool desert night cloak her. Her training drilled instinctively. Lend, observe, wait. One misstep and the patrol could spot her. Then she'd be fighting while injured, a gamble with odds stacked against her. She crawled to the top of a small rise and paused. From there, the enemy compound spread across a plateau like a scar across the landscape. Floodlights, barbed wire, watchtowers, and the unmistakable hum of generators. Inside, she knew, were the warlords responsible for the ambush, the men who had murdered her teammates and orchestrated attacks across provinces. Hale's stomach clenched, but fear was replaced by something sharper, anger. Halle crouched in the shadow of a jagged outcrop and studied guard patterns. 2 at the main gate, rotating every 15 minutes. Towers had spotlights sweeping in arcs. Trucks rested near the inner courtyard. She counted patrols, at least a dozen men moving in shifts. Observation alone would not suffice. She needed access, advantage, and the element of surprise. Her eyes drifted to the prisoners, barely visible through a dimly lit cell block. 2 American voices, grunts and low moans, echoed faintly. They were alive, beaten, chained, their supplies stripped. Hale's jaw tightened. Every instinct told her that a direct rescue would be too dangerous without weakening the compound first. She couldn't risk it blindly. She needed a plan. She remembered Michigan, the bow hunting lessons from her father, patience, precision, knowing the land, and ranger training, improvisation, understanding enemy behavior, using terrain. Halle calculated distractions, weak points, timing. She could take the generators offline, create chaos, and use the darkness as her ally. Improvised explosives from enemy supplies, grenades, fuel, scrap metal, could become her weapons. She wasn't just injured. She was invisible, a shadow they would not anticipate. Hours passed, and the moon arced across the sky. Halle moved closer, rolling over rocky ridges, each step sending sparks of pain through her torso. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she forced them forward. Every step required measured breathing. One wrong move, and she would end up like her fallen teammates. She couldn't afford that, not tonight, not ever. By dawn, Holly had reached a ridge directly overlooking the inner compound. From here, she could see the high-ranking warlords in the inner chamber. The leaders were surrounded by guards, planning movements, reviewing maps. This was where command pulsed, and taking it down meant more than survival. It meant justice, retribution for her fallen brothers. Holly crouched behind a jagged outcrop, patching a ragged bandage over her bleeding side. Her thoughts flickered to the teammates she might never see again, the ones whose laughter and camaraderie had defined deployments. Her chest ached, not just from broken ribs, but from rage, grief, and a determination she had never known she could summon. She touched the AK, testing its weight. Every magazine, every round, had to count. Her first step had to be precise, her strikes deliberate. Improvisation and patience would be her allies. She would take the compound apart, piece by piece, if she had to. And she would rescue her teammates. The sun began to rise behind the distant mountains, painting the valley in muted gold. Holly pressed herself into the shadow of the ridge, barely breathing. Below, the enemy compound came alive with movement. Guards yelled, trucks revved, and a new day began for them, unaware that a ghost had already entered their domain. Hale's mind sharpened. She mapped patrol rotations in her head, memorized every door, every staircase, every choke point. Improvised explosives would be placed at key locations, and her entry would be silent, invisible. Her thoughts flickered to contingencies. If she were discovered, if she lost the element of surprise, if she failed. One thing was certain: failure wasn't an option. Not for her, not for her team. She crouched as an enemy truck rumbled beneath her position. Unaware, she watched. Holly traced its path, noting blind spots in patrols. Every detail mattered. She could see the path to the inner compound, and a plan began to form, layer by layer. By nightfall, she would move, strike, and perhaps survive long enough to see vengeance done. The heat of the day began to bake the rocks, forcing Holly to find shade and conserve energy. Her canteen was low. She rationed every sip. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but fear of discovery kept her moving faster than any hunger pang could slow. She thought about how long she could survive alone in the desert, wounded and behind enemy lines. But she didn't allow herself to calculate failure. Only the mission mattered. As dusk approached, Holly tested her improvised traps. Pieces of wire, grenades, and fuel containers were arranged carefully, unseen from below. She moved quietly, practicing the route she would take once night fell, mentally rehearsing every motion, every kill shot, every escape path. The compound had to burn, the warlords had to fall, and her team had to live. By night, Holly had become almost invisible, a shadow among shadows, one with the rocks and dust. Patrols moved beneath her, unaware. And then she paused, realizing the moment had arrived, the night of reckoning. Her choice was no longer abstract. She would strike, and nothing would stop her, not exhaustion, not pain, not the enemy. Her heartbeat steadied. She touched the AK, fingers curled over cold metal. Every sense was alive. Holly whispered a silent vow, her voice swallowed by wind. I will finish this. They will answer. And with that, she melted into darkness, ready to reclaim what had been stolen and to burn the enemy's empire to ashes. Night fell like a curtain, and Holly moved through it as if she were woven from shadow. The compound beneath her pulsed with a dozen small lights and the dull orange glow of lanterns. The generator throbbed like a mechanical heart, steady and sure, its rhythm the axis around which the place breathed. If she stopped that heartbeat, The whole body would convulse. She eased down the slope, each movement deliberate, all sound swallowed by the scrub and stone. Every breath was measured against the pain in her ribs. The AK dug into her shoulder, heavy with the truth that each round might be the difference between life and discovery. Her hands were steady. Her mind was a razor. She was not a soldier in a squad tonight. She was a one-woman storm. At the perimeter, razor wire glinted under a sliver of moon. Holly slid through a gap where the fence had been torn by a truck tire, the opening small enough to force a crouch. Her palms burned against the cold metal as she hauled herself through. Feet whispering on compacted sand, she ghosted toward the maintenance shed where the generator coughed and spat. A single guard lounged nearby, cigarette tip a dim ember. She watched him for a heartbeat and saw the pattern. Head turned, mouth moving as he muttered with a companion inside. Patience. The years stalking deer in Michigan came. Back wait until the moment between breaths. When the guard shifted, Holly was already across the shadow line. Her knife flashed, a clean motion. The man never had the chance to turn. Holly dragged him into darkness, muffled the body with a torn field jacket, and recycled the cigarette into silence. She worked quickly, fingers nimble despite the cold and blood beneath her nails. Inside the shed, wiring and ducts formed a maze. She found the generator's control box and used a scrap of metal to short the terminal enough to trip the system, not enough to scorch cables beyond reason. The lights dinned from the compound like a drawn breath. First towers, then courtyards, then the inner sanctum. Darkness is a thief and an ally. It corrodes confidence and conceals intent. Shouts fractured the night as searchlights blinked and men stumbled into corridors. Fires flared from overturned lamps. Holly moved like a seam through a torn garment, following the sound of alarm and using it to cloak her approach. The generator's silence had done more than plunge them into night. It had scattered their coordinated eye into fractured panic. She found the cell block by listening for noise, the rattle of chains, the soft curse of a man trying to steady a breath. The door was iron and heavy, bolted from the outside, a slit of barred shadow separating captor from captive. Holly crouched, feeling the roughness of the stone floor press into her palms. Her fingers trembled when she touched the lock. It was crudely made, heavy iron teeth welded together, likely forged locally. She had a bayonet from the downed pilot's kit in her pack, an old war relic, serrated and hungry. She slipped it into the lock and worked the mechanism like a lockpicker taught by necessity, rather than instruction. Small motions, pressure, patience. A cough interrupted her. The figure in the cell shifted, a muffled sound of hope or surprise. Holly froze, listening for the whisper of someone else. No footfalls, just the two American breaths and the distant chaos. She eased the hasp free and pushed the heavy door inward with a practiced shoulder. The smell hit her first: sweat, rot, and the metallic tang of blood. Then eyes, wide and incredulous, sliding into recognition. They were thinner than she remembered, faces hollowed by beatings and the desert. Rains, she found him first, eyelids swollen, but he recognized the radio collar she'd worn during the mission and mouthed her name. Next to him, Corporal Mendez, weaker, chipped tooth, and a bruise the color of old bruise. Both looked at the silhouette at the doorway, and something like disbelief softened into raw animal joy. "Jessica?" Mendez rasped, voice a blade through cloth. Holly moved closer, hands traveling quick over each chain. Her fingers blurred. The lock bits scraped until they gave. Metal clanked. Chains fell. Mendez sagged forward, pressing his face into the crook of Hell's shoulder, sobs barely muffled. Rains laughed, half a sob, half a bark, then coughed again until tears burned his eyes. Something human and ragged and priceless surged between them, relief so sharp it hurt. "Stay quiet," Halle whispered, voice a low rasp, one hand on Mende's shoulder to steady him. "Stay quiet. I'll handle this." She checked their wounds with a clinical yet tender efficiency. Bandages were torn and re-torn from her own kit. She applied them with rough hands, knotting them twice. Mendez leaned into the pressure, fingers curling around her wrist. "Jess, you shouldn't have," he started, then stopped. There were no words that fit the moment. Only plans. They needed time, and time was a commodity sold too dearly in a place like this. Halle assessed. Food gone, water scarce, chains crude, but recently oiled. A guard shift changed in 7 minutes. If they could move during the scramble, they might slip the courtyard and find cover in the dead trucks. But she had something else in mind. The inner chamber, the heart of the compound, was where the generals gathered, and tonight, with the power out, there was confusion enough to create opportunity. But Halle didn't want to simply distract. She wanted to wound them surgically, cripple command so the rest would scatter and flee. "Can you walk?" she asked, a soldier's bluntness cutting through sentiment. Mendez nodded slowly, face pale but jaw set. Rains gripped the AK she'd given him, fingers white around the stock. They were not combat ready, but they were breathing and, more importantly, hopeful. Hope kills complacency and breeds the audacity to move. Halle peered through the bars into the courtyard. Shapes moved like clumped shadows, men synchronized in confusion. A bell rang somewhere, the outer gate reacting to Cum's loss, a siren wailing like a wounded animal. It worked in their favor. She had planned for devices and diversions. She had not planned for the visceral relief lighting Mendez's face, or the way Rain's eyes burned with the knowledge of being freed. That closeness grounded her. She tightened her jaw and recited the route 2 towers to the left. A storage shed bunched with crates that would shield a sprint, the smashed Humvee near the south gate as final cover. "We move on my count," she breathed. 1 minute to the next guard shift. When they bark and run toward the generator, follow me. Keep low. If anyone yells, you drop. Understood? They nodded. In that simple nod, a pact was sealed raw, human, irrevocable. Halle thought of Torres and the men taken earlier, of the pilot's empty seat in the wreck, of the folded flag her mother might receive if she failed. Each thought tightened the coil inside her, until it was a living thing that wanted to be released. Halle checked the magazine in her AK, clicked it into place. The weapon sat hot under her hand, a cold promise. She eased open the cell door and embraced darkness again. The compound's shrieks and the clatter of feet were a chorus for their small rebellion. Mendez leaned on her when they moved, weight pressing against wind and grief. Rains, AK held low, kept his eyes on shadows, on corners, on the promises of danger. They crossed the threshold. Hale's lungs burned with effort, ribs a constant howl that threatened to slow her. But guilt and resolve are better stimulants than adrenaline alone. She kept them walking, kept their pace steady. Behind them, like a pulse, the generator's lights remained dead. She sang no anthems. She uttered no grand lines. Her voice was a dry knife. "Stay quiet. I'll handle this." The words were for them and for herself, an order, a prayer, and a promise. They stepped into the hunting dark, and Halle felt, for the first time since the crash, the faint, electric taste of possibility. The inner chamber sat at the compound's core like a black jewel set in iron-thick doors, reinforced walls, and the kind of quiet that smells of confidence. Halle watched it from a shadowed alcove, breathing shallow so her ribs didn't rasp like an alarm. The chamber's windows were small slits, the kind meant to let light in and prisoners out, never the other way around. Tonight, those slits framed silhouettes hunched over maps and radios, the outlines of men with more power than reason. She had watched them for hours, learning the cadence of their nights, the way one general favored the eastern chair, the way another kept a thin man with a cigarette always near his hand. Little things, the placement of a cigarette pack, the direction a guard's boot pointed, became the architecture of her plan. Taking the chamber would not be a matter of brute force. It would be a study of precision, timing, and the cruel arithmetic of making a few hits count more than 1,000 misses. Hale's pack was lighter now, stripped of excess weight with an efficiency born from necessity. She had fashioned charges from scavenged fuel cans, wired them to grenades pilfered from a weapons cache, and wrapped them in scrap metal to act as fragmentation. Her hands shook the first time she connected 2 wires. The second and third times, the movement was steadier. These were crude devices, born of desperation and ingenuity, but they were enough to turn a hallway into a shuttered maw. She had positioned them in her mind like chess pieces, detonators at choke points, smaller charges to collapse stairwells, and one larger device tucked near the chamber door. The goal was not to slaughter indiscriminately, but to sever command, cut communications, sever leadership, force chaos. Her 2 liberated teammates limped beside her in the deeper shadows, their breaths short, the taste of dust and blood heavy on their tongues. Mendez walked with a stoic limp, his left arm hanging awkwardly. Rains propped himself on Hale's shoulder more than his own legs. Their eyes, hollowed by captivity, flicked toward the chamber when she spoke of it, an animal mixture of fear and hunger, the desire for retribution mingled with the need to survive. "You rest here," Hale murmured, sliding them into a gnarl of boulders that broke the line of sight to patrols. "I'm going up. If anything goes wrong, run east, find the ravine. Don't stop." Her voice was soft but sharp, the kind that builds a backbone from a single syllable. They protested small, stubborn noises. She silenced them with the look she had used for years, a glance that carried authority born not of rank, but of trust. They stayed put, faces pale but set, as she moved toward the inner approach. The path she chose snaked through supply sheds and a ruined vehicle depot. Boxes were stacked in an artless manner, fodder for a shooter's cover or homemade barricade. Hale moved like someone mapping invisible lines, pressing her weight against crates, listening as men searched the generators and bickered. Occasionally, a flashlight swept the area and tore a brief river of white across her skin. She flattened herself against wood until it passed, thinking only of her lungs and her timing. She reached a maintenance tunnel that connected to the chamber's annex. The tunnel was narrow and smelled of oil and old sweat. Rivulets had carved paths in the concrete where rain or spilled fuel had found purchase. This was the kind of place a man could crawl and listen, and that was exactly what she did. Hale crawled forward, every inch counting, until she was under a ventilation grate that fed directly into the chamber's adjacencies. From here she could hear voices clearly, men laughing softly, the clack of dice on a table somewhere deeper inside, the low command voice of the warlord known as Cater, whose accent sliced like glass. He exuded a charisma that had wrapped itself around violence. He was comfortable, surrounded by maps and men who flattered him for favors and slaughter. Hale's breath slowed. She took out the map she'd sketched from memory guard movements, supply crates, reinforcement routes, and consulted it like a coach with a playbook. The guards rotated every 20 minutes. 2 men watched the corridor adjacent to the chamber, and between them, a blind corner where the light didn't reach. That blind corner was where she would start. She checked the improvised timer on her primary device, an old watch rigged to a grenade's pin set to match the moment the shift change would pull eyes away. A carved notch in a crate served as her marker. At that tick, she would strike. The plan required a cascade. The outer charges would detonate first small detonations, that would draw bodies and bullets toward the chaos. In that confusion, she would breach a secondary door and move into the chamber with a charge to isolate the generals from their guards. It would need to be surgical. One false kick, and the entire compound would pour like water over them. She thought of the many soldiers who had practiced clearing rooms in training bunkers, of the drills that taught reflex and restraint. Those teachings now lived inside her, braided with her father's hunting patience and the cold calculus of revenge. She crawled back through the narrow tunnel, placing small charges into the seam where the tunnel met the corridor. Each device slid into place like a secret, frangible as a promise. Her hands worked with rhythm, knotting wires, tucking cloth, sealing triggers behind rusted bolts. Once, someone cursed nearby, and the sound made her jaw clench so hard her teeth ached. But she kept moving, every device a step toward breaking the chamber's spine. When the charges were set, she returned to the boulder where Mendez and Rains waited. The sky had thinned toward dawn, stars paling into a bruise of blue. Halle checked their faces. Mendez's eyes were closed, exhausted. Rains stared at the horizon, jaw clenched, trembling with a mixture of fear and eagerness. "You ready?" she asked. She needed no verbal consent. The look they gave her was assent enough. She tucked a small flare into her vest, a crude signal to herself that the moment had arrived. Halle had rehearsed the movement in her head until each detail was fossilized. The detonation, the breach, the sweep through the chamber. She counted breaths, one for the click of a lighter in a distant tent, 2 for a guard's laugh, 3 for the scrape of a chair. Then she moved. The first explosion was a dry, hollow crack that rolled through the compound like a warning. Men yelled and ran. Lights snapped as backup generators kicked and failed. Halle surged from shadow to shadow, the world reduced to the beat of her heart and the thunder in her chest. Gunshots split the air in jagged bursts. Smoke rose in black tongues. She hit the corridor, planted her charge at the seam, and put distance between herself and the blast. Her ears screamed. Metal shrieked and dust rained. The corridor she had just passed buckled, a cloud of debris swallowing the sound of men running. She moved with a speed that surprised her, fueled by a clarity that had nothing to do with painkillers or training. This was hunger in human form, the desire to end a cruelty. A guard burst from a side room, stumble-shot at the sight of her silhouette, and she pinned him with a single rifle round to the forehead. He crumpled soundlessly. The inner door loomed like an altar. Halle strapped the larger device against it, hands sure despite the adrenaline hitching at the base of them. She tucked the detonator under a crate and ran, the charge's timer a steady tick inside her skull. She could have rushed then, fired and taken the room by brute force, but the plan demanded patience. She ducked behind an overturned jeep and waited as the world detonated into a new chaos. Shouts, orders in a dozen dialects, men calling for reinforcements, someone crying out in pain. When the door finally blew, it did so with a sound like a cliff falling. Splinters of wood and shards of concrete exploded outward, and a tidal wave of men spilled into the corridor, confusion on their faces, rank forgotten. Halle moved through that tide like a blade through silk, low and efficient. Her AK arced in controlled bursts, each shot precise, aimed at the hands that would reach for radios, at the men who tried to form a shield around the generals. Smoke and dust blurred everything into indistinct monstrous shapes, but the generals, those black-helmeted men who believed themselves gods, were suddenly human, eyes wide and searching for exits they had not kept open. Halle found them in the center, clustered like an overeager flock around a table of maps. Their faces were blurs of beard and hatred, but she had learned their shapes cater with the cigarette. Al-Rashid, the rotund strategist, 2 others with syringes of cruelty and certainty. They reached for pistols. Hale's shot cracked and took the first out at the shoulder. He went down, cursing. The second tried to call for order. Hale's next round clipped his hand, and the gun skittered. Men lunged, but with the inner command fractured, their reflexes were slow, their discipline unraveling. Holly moved with the terrible, impossible calm of someone who has already lost everything and gained a deadly freedom. She placed her final device on the table between them, a small, brutal charge not meant to obliterate, but to end. She set it with a steady hand and looked at each man in turn. There was no mercy in her face, only the quiet of someone executing a verdict. The chamber's air was thick with smoke, the metallic tang of fear and blood, and through it, the sound of distant alarms stitched like a last attempt at order. When she pressed the button, the explosion was a focused, precise thing that cleaved the room. Metal screamed and men fell. Dust filled her lungs. Grit became taste. When the ringing in her ears faded to a steady hum, she stood amid ruin, breathing hard, rifle at the ready. In the center, where a map had once spread like a promise of domination, the generals lay scorched and still. She took in the sight like a witness to the collapse of an entire web of violence. Around her, guards staggered, dazed and leaderless, their world suddenly hollow. Halle felt the first true surge of something like triumph, and then, like a colder tide, the awareness of what came next. The compound would not stay in ruins. Men would swarm from every village within a day. The moment gave her no time to savor the victory. There were still steps to take, people to recover, allies to reach. She squared her shoulders, the taste of gunpowder in her mouth, and moved to the cell block to retrieve her men. The inner chamber had been taken, but the night was not yet done. You said, smoke and dust coiled through the compound like slow-moving thunder. Hale's lungs burned with each breath, grit shredding her throat, but the taste of success was iron-cold and immediate. The inner chamber was a ruin of smashed maps and splintered wood. The generals lay unmoving in angles that denied any dignity. Alarms still screamed somewhere in the bowels of the compound, but order had been severed at its spine. The command had fallen. She moved without hesitation, counting on muscle memory and a trader's instinct for timing. Mendes and Rains emerged from the cell block pale with shock and relief, their steps unsteady but purposeful. Haile fed them water from her dented canteen, hands steady despite the tremor riding her arms. The brief human mercy one cupped sip each anchored them to the mission. Escape, avoid reinforcements, survive. We go now, she said, voice low and hoarse. Stick close. Low and fast. Eyes open. A flare of movement caught her peripheral vision. A knot of guards massing where a collapsed watchtower had once given them a height advantage. Without leadership, they were trying to reassert control shouts, hand signals, a desperate attempt at order. Halle scanned the courtyard. Trucks lay overturned, a Humvee smoldered near the perimeter, and crates of supplies had become impromptu barricades. Smoke shrouded everything, turning shapes into threats. She chose speed over stealth. With the element of surprise dwindling, patience would become a death sentence. Halle bolstered Mendes under an arm and put a calming squeeze on Rain's shoulder. They moved as a small unit, weaving between shadows, boots thudding over shattered tile and glass. The AK kicked with each shot she took when necessary short, accurate bursts that tore gaps into advancing men who tried to form an intersection. Halfway across the courtyard, a scream split the air. A general, one of the surviving lieutenants, had staggered to his feet and was barking orders into a radio, his voice thin with adrenaline. Hale's eyes locked on him. He was trying to rally the remaining fighters, to gather them into a coherent response. If he succeeded, their escape would be hamstrung. The calculus was simple. Stop him now, or fight an organized force 2 minutes from now. She moved like a shadow through smoke, feet finding purchase on wet oil and scattered rubble. Rains covered their rear, quick shots thudding into the shoulders of men who reached for rifles. Mendez, though limping, found places to wedge his weight and snap a headshot when a man tried to flank them. Their small violence was efficient, surgical, and terrible. Each enemy downed reduced the net closing around them. Across the courtyard, the last general had vaulted onto a truck to gain a higher view. He turned, eyes blazing not with fear, but with the animal arrogance of a man convinced of his invulnerability. He shouted in a language Halle understood only in cadence and tone. Commands, curses, threats. His voice rallied a few men who had not yet broken. He was a weathercock of resolve, and when the weathercock turns, storms follow. Halle didn't hesitate. She sprinted forward, instincts honed on training ranges and battlefields, each stride cutting open the space between her and the truck. Rains kept the perimeter clear, firing controlled bursts that cut down any who lunged toward them. Mendez covered their blind side, flinging himself into a firefight to give them a clean lane. Halle moved like a lever, a concentrated push against panic. The courtyard convulsed, men called, bullets stitched the air, and a truck's metal groaned under the stress of weight and fire. Halle vaulted over a half-buried crate and saw the general spinning to aim a pistol. Time telescoped into a sequence of small decisions. Breath, sight, squeeze. Halle fired, the muzzle snap echoing off concrete. The general's pistol arm flailed. His hand went slack. He stumbled from the truck, a string of Arabic curses choking in his throat. But he didn't fall. The general was thrown into a tumble that carried him toward the compound's rear gate, an open patch where vehicles could exit if engines were started. He scrambled over a smear of oil and launched himself into a sprint toward the gate's shadows, firing as he ran. Men took his cue. Instinct welded them into a pursuit. Halle saw the line of desperation and made a choice. She would not let him reach the gate. Every extra minute meant reinforcements, means of escape for the enemy, and the risk of soldiers hunting them down in the ravine beyond. She pursued. The chase turned the courtyard into a corridor of fire. Halle ducked beneath a low awning as tracer rounds stitched the air above her head, sparks hissing where they struck metal. The general darted over a slammed gate and barreled through a service lane, gloved hands slapping a keypad that sparked, but did not open. Someone had sabotaged it in the blast. He snarled, breath ragged, and pushed off into the rutted dirt road beyond the outer compound wall. Halle didn't give him the luxury of distance. Her pace was raw, the shots from Rains thinning the crowd behind her. They cut through a line of supply crates, Hale's lungs burning so hard she felt the world tilt. The general was fast, a wiry man with the feral grace of someone who had spent life in survival. But Halle had endurance sharpened by necessity. She gained on him as they left the last of the compound's shadow and spilled into the open. A flat stretch of desolation, half lit by the morning's orange bleeding through smoke. The general glanced back, eyes wild, calculation and panic doing battle. He had one last resource, a ring of men stationed near the outer road, not yet fully committed to the pursuit. If he could reach them, they'd have vehicles, mounted guns, and the logistics to keep fighting. Halle felt the geometry of the world realign. Sprint now, or let a predator live. She ran. Their feet pounded the dirt in a rhythm that tasted like weathered stone and hot metal. A general's breaths came in ragged intervals. A thin bead of blood traced his temple where shrapnel had nicked him. He pulled a pistol and fired once over his shoulder, a shot that whistled past Hale's ear. Pain flared, but did not cripple. The desert air held the smell of gunpowder and something older iron and smoke, and the ghost of burnt olive wood. Halle reached him mere meters from the outer road. He stumbled, hands scrabbling at the air as if to grasp fate itself. The ring of men were too far to matter. She was too close for him to pull the pistol cleanly. Training and the raw force of righteous fury converged into a single motion. Hale raised the AK, took a breath that tasted like ash, and fired. The bullet found purchase at the base of the throat, a precise, fatal mark. The general's body folded in on itself, like a marionette cut from its strings. He crumpled into the dust, mouth opening once in a soundless oath, eyes going blank. The world contracted the chase, the shouts, the guns, then spread again into a strange calm. Around her, the courtyard fires burned down into embers. Men staggered and swore, some looking to commit to the remaining fight, others melting into flight. Hale stood over the fallen man, the gun an extension of her arm, sweat and dust decorating her face. For a long moment, she simply watched him breathe his last breath and stop. It was not triumph. It was completion. A dark, terrible work had been done. She felt both hollow and full, as though taking the man's life had carved out a space inside her where grief and vengeance could coexist without collapsing. Mendez stumbled up beside her, hand trembling as he reached for her arm. Rains came next, breathing hard, eyes wet but fixed. They did not celebrate. Their silence was a liturgy for all they had lost and for the fortunate cruelty of surviving. Hale lowered her rifle and let the reality of the moment sink in. The generals were dead. The compound's head severed, their chains dissolved by fire and metal. The immediate battle was won, but the echoing truth remained like a shadow at noon. The compound's defeat would ripple through the region. Fighters would regroup in the nearby valleys. Villages might swell with reprisals. More blood might be spilled before peace had a chance to reconfigure. They had done something enormous and dangerous. The cost was only just beginning to be accounted for. Hale rifles through her pack, checking ammunition, counting the rounds left like a priest counting beads. The radios were dead in the rubble, and the silence that followed felt almost holy until the distant thrum of engines reached them, a note of reinforcements possibly coming from further afield. She straightened, the ache in her ribs a constant metronome. "Move," she said quietly, to Mendez and Rains. "Now. In and out, no stops." They moved faster now, driven by the knowledge that victory had its own dangers. Hale cast one last glance at the general's still face, the ash of his arrogance drifting across his cheek like a faded flag. She turned away and led her men toward the shadows and the broken roads, toward the small, dangerous hope of survival and extraction. Silence followed, heavy and real. The compound smoldered behind them, a wound that would not easily heal. The morning sun rose pale and brittle over the desert, painting the charred compound in muted gold. Smoke spiraled into the sky, carrying the scent of burnt metal and scorched earth. Hale kept her AK slung low, eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow, every possibility of ambush. Mendez limped beside her, favoring his left side, while Rains followed closely, still trembling from adrenaline but keeping pace. The courtyard, now empty of leaders and nearly all guards, was behind them, but the mountains ahead promised new dangers. The enemy had only begun to realize the extent of their loss. Hale led them east, toward a narrow ravine she had scouted days ago, while observing patrols from a hidden perch. Her body screamed in protest. Broken ribs throbbed with every stride, muscles cramped, and every inhalation sliced through her chest. Yet exhaustion was a luxury she could not afford. The ravine was their shield and their path to safety, a natural corridor carved into the desert mountains that could hide them from pursuers and drones. She moved with a rhythm that combined stealth and speed, low, deliberate, measured, with eyes scanning both the terrain and the sky. They reached the foot of the ravine, just as the first reinforcements began to converge on the compound. Dust kicked up in the distance, a wall of sand signaling trucks and jeeps arriving to reclaim what they had lost. Hale felt the surge of urgency that always follows victory. Enemies in disarray can regroup, but the moment to escape is finite. She waved her teammates into the shadows of the canyon walls. The path narrowed, forcing them single file. Hale went first, listening to every noise, the rustle of stones, the distant clatter of vehicles, the harsh bark of shouted orders. The walls of the ravine were jagged, perfect for concealment. Hale climbed over boulders with precision, pressing her back against the stone when necessary, and pulled Mendez and Rains after her. Their breathing was heavy but controlled, guided by her voice. Halfway up the ravine, Hale paused to survey the ridge above. Enemy vehicles rumbled in the valley below, forming a cordon. Patrols had begun ascending the slopes, armed and alert, but they were few and uncoordinated. Hale calculated quickly. If they stayed low, hidden by the canyon walls, they could move parallel to the enemy's advance without being detected. Every minute counted. Every sound mattered. The terrain grew rougher, jagged rock faces, sudden drops, and loose scree that threatened to send them tumbling into the canyon below. Hale assisted Mendez over a particularly sharp drop, her hands cutting into his jacket, her eyes scanning for movement. Rains followed with a silent oath to stay close. Each step required full focus. A misstep could end the mission in a second. But the mountains, like old friends, guided them. Narrow ledges and overhangs provided cover, boulders created natural choke points, and the early light played shadows that masked their passage. Hours passed. Hale pushed them forward, pausing only when absolutely necessary. She scavenged small patches of desert vegetation for water content, split rations among the three of them, and pressed her hands to Mendez and Rain's wounds to check for bleeding or bruising. She whispered instructions and encouragement. Not words of comfort would slow them, and speed was life. They reached a plateau that overlooked a narrow valley below. Hale crouched, scanning the terrain. Dust clouds churned as enemy vehicles scoured the desert, their engines a mechanical roar. She counted them: 6 trucks, 3 jeeps, and a motorcycle moving along the canyon edge. None had yet spotted them. Hale clenched her jaw. Timing was critical. If they descended too early, they risked being run down. Too late, and the canyon might narrow into a dead end. Using hand signals, she guided her team along a higher ledge, keeping just out of sight. Each step was a calculation: rock stability, line of sight, the distance from potential enemies. Hale remembered ranger training, desert navigation, and her father's hunting lessons. Every skill coalesced into a singular focus. They were shadows, ghosts slipping past the enemy's grasp. By late afternoon, the ravine opened to a flatter area covered in sparse scrub. Hale motioned them to stop. The valley below was too exposed, and the enemy had started setting trap-strip wires, claymore-like devices, makeshift snares she had noted in her reconnaissance. The path through the valley would be deadly without careful planning. She studied the area, mapping a route through rocks and vegetation that minimized exposure. She rationed the remaining water and food, knowing the next safe spot was at least 12 hours away. As the sun dipped lower, Hale spotted movement in the distance. A small drone hovering above the compound, scanning for survivors. She flattened herself against a rock, breathing shallow, eyes wide, waiting until it passed out of sight. Technology had changed the battlefield, but intuition and terrain still mattered. The drone could only see what reflected light. By staying low and moving with the shadows, they could remain invisible. Night fell, and the temperature dropped sharply. Hale built a small concealed fire, just enough to warm their hands without producing smoke visible from afar. Mendes and Rains huddled close, shivering. Hale bandaged their wounds again, checking for infection and ensuring the limited supplies were properly applied. She whispered instructions. They would move under cover of darkness, following a winding path that kept them in shadow. Exhaustion pressed hard against them, but every step mattered. Hours later, Hale led them down a winding cliffside path into a small canyon that would eventually bring them closer to the border. The terrain forced them single file, every step cautious, every movement deliberate. From above, the night sky glittered with stars, but Hale's eyes were fixed on the trail, mapping every rock, crevice, and potential trap. The desert was quiet, but the silence was deceptive. Enemies could be anywhere, and the terrain itself could be lethal. By the early morning, they reached a small cave that offered both concealment and shelter. Hale guided them inside, checking for loose rock and signs of predators. It would be their first safe point since leaving the compound. She laid them down, using the cave wall as a brace for Mendes' side and Rain's injured ankle. They finally allowed themselves to breathe fully, though Hale's mind remained alert. Outside, the desert was waking. Birds called, and the wind shifted. Hale listened carefully, noting every sound, ensuring no patrols approached. She whispered survival instructions to her team. Conserve energy, drink sparingly, stay low during the day, and move only at night. They had survived the compound and the immediate chase, but they were not yet safe. For the first time in 2 days, Hale allowed herself a moment to reflect. She thought of her fallen team, the ones she had lost, and the justice she had dealt. But her mind immediately shifted forward. The mountains still held dangers, and the journey to safety was far from over. Every misstep now could be fatal. By midday, the sun scorched the plateau, and Hale decided they would rest, hidden among boulders, conserving energy until the next night. Water was nearly gone, and food limited to a handful of rations. Every resource mattered. Every step needed planning. She examined the map she had memorized, considering paths, blind spots, and possible ambush points. Survival demanded foresight, endurance, and ruthless efficiency. As night fell again, Hale led them along a ridge overlooking a dry riverbed. They descended slowly, using the cover of shadows, and the world around them seemed to stretch into infinity. Hale knew that if they kept their pace, avoided detection, and used the terrain intelligently, they could reach friendly coordinates within 3 days. But she also knew the enemy would not stop searching. Each night was a gamble, each step a calculation, and mistakes could cost them everything. By dawn, they reached a natural bottleneck in the canyon, a narrow passage flanked by cliffs. Hale crouched, scanning for patrols, traps, or enemy scouts. The wind shifted, and she could hear the faintest hint of engines miles away too far to threaten them immediately, but close, enough to remind her the chase was not over. She signaled Mendes and Rains to follow her lead, every gesture precise, rehearsed, practiced in silence. Hours later, they emerged from the canyon into an area of higher elevation. Hale paused to survey the desert below, noting patrol routes, landmarks, and likely enemy positions. From here, they could see the outline of villages and roads that might provide escape or contact with allied forces. The mountains had been their refuge, but now the challenge was moving forward without being spotted. Hale felt the first glimmer of hope in days. The desert had been cruel, the enemy relentless, but she had survived. Mendes and Rains were battered, but alive, and the path to safety, though perilous, was in sight. Hale allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the pulse of life beneath the exhaustion. The fight was not over, but they had crossed a threshold. Survival was possible. With a final glance at the stars above, Hale whispered to herself, a vow as quiet as the wind through the canyon. we make it out. All of us. No one else dies today. And with that, she led them forward, every step a blend of endurance, strategy, and unyielding resolve. Halle led her small team along the rugged mountain trails, every step a battle against exhaustion and pain. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, and the weight of broken ribs slowed her, yet she pressed on. Mendes and Rains followed closely, their injuries forcing her to adjust pace after pace, stop after stop. Every time one stumbled, Halle supported them with a strength that surprised even her. The ravine, once their shield, now became a labyrinth of risk. Rocks could give way, loose scree could send them tumbling, and enemy patrols might intercept them at any turn. Her mind ran through the options. To the east lay the nearest Allied outpost, over 30 miles of mountainous terrain and exposed ridges. To the west, a winding road could lead to a river crossing, but it was heavily monitored. Her instincts screamed to stick to the shadows, to hug the cliffs, to make every movement a whisper in the wind. Halle charted a course that would take them along a high ledge, one barely visible from below, and then descend into a hidden valley before nightfall. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Hale's breaths came sharp and shallow, each inhalation a knife in her side. Mendes winced with every step, but Halle adjusted her grip and kept him moving, whispering instructions that were more mantra than guidance. Rains, carrying a small pack of the limited supplies they had scavenged, stumbled occasionally, but caught himself on Hale's outstretched hand. The mountains were silent, except for the distant cries of birds and the whisper of wind through jagged rocks. Yet every sound seemed amplified in Hale's mind, an enemy scout. The crunch of gravel under a patrol boot or the snap of a twig could alert foes to their position. By late afternoon, they reached a narrow ledge overlooking a steep canyon. Halle paused, pressing herself against the rock wall. The enemy had begun to search systematically, patrols forming patterns she had memorized from observation. Trucks rumbled faintly in the distance. Men shouted, their voices carried by the wind. Halle studied their movements, calculating the exact window they had to descend into the valley below without being seen. Timing was everything. One misstep could mean capture or worse. She led them down slowly, her hands gripping the jagged stone, supporting Mendes as he maneuvered his injured legs. The descent was precarious. Loose rocks tumbled under their weight, echoing down the canyon walls. Rains followed, catching stones before they rolled away. Each step was meticulous, calculated. Hale's voice remained a calm whisper, steadying her team, reminding them that survival depended on silence, precision, and endurance. By dusk, they reached a hidden grove in the valley, a natural alcove shielded from view. Halle instructed them to rest, her eyes scanning every ridge and shadow for enemy movement. They drank the last of their water sparingly, rationing their remaining rations for what she estimated would be a 2-day journey through mountainous terrain to reach friendly forces. The quiet of the grove was deceptive. Halle knew the enemy would not give up. The search for survivors would intensify at dawn. She reinforced their concealment with rocks and sparse foliage, ensuring no obvious tracks led to them. Nightfall brought a chill, and Halle used her own jacket to cover Mendes, who shivered from exhaustion and blood loss. Rains leaned against her shoulder, eyelids heavy. Hale's mind, however, was alert and calculating. She studied the terrain, noting potential paths, natural shelters, and water sources. Every detail mattered. One miscalculation could result in death or the loss of the survivors she had fought so hard to save. She whispered instructions for the next leg of their journey. Move at night, rest at dawn, keep low, avoid open terrain, and use every shadow as a shield. When darkness fully enveloped the valley, Halle led them again, moving like ghosts along a narrow ledge that ran above the dry riverbed. Her muscles screamed with fatigue, her ribs burned with each inhalation, but there was no alternative. She forced herself forward, driven by the singular thought of survival and the knowledge that failure was not an option. Mendez and Rains followed, limping and leaning on her strength, their trust in her absolute. Halfway through the night, they encountered a natural choke point, a collapsed rock arch that could have blocked their path entirely. Halle assessed quickly. Climbing over was risky, but the valley floor was open and exposed. She chose the arch, using her hands and legs to hoist herself over the jagged stone, then assisted Mendez and Rains across. The air was filled with tension, every creak and scrape a potential alarm. When they finally cleared it, Halle allowed herself a brief moment to catch her breath, the adrenaline still surging through her veins. Dawn broke as they reached a higher ridge. Halle paused to survey the valley below. Smoke still rose from the compound they had destroyed, a grim reminder of what they had accomplished and the danger that still pursued them. She could see enemy patrols in the distance, searching methodically, but unaware of their path. Halle signaled Mendez and Rains to remain low and follow her descent along a natural ridge that led to a secondary riverbed, a route she had memorized during reconnaissance before the mission. The descent was grueling. Loose rocks slid beneath their feet, every step a potential disaster. Hale's body protested violently, pain lancing through her ribs and legs. But the thought of extraction, of returning to safety, kept her moving. Mendez and Rains leaned heavily on her, exhausted but determined to survive. Each step was a battle between instinct and endurance. By late afternoon, they reached a shallow riverbed that ran along the edge of a sparsely forested area. Halle paused to check their injuries. Mendez's bleeding had slowed, bandages intact. Rain's ankle was swollen, but manageable. Halle drank sparingly, conserving what little water remained for the final leg of their journey. She assessed the forested area ahead, noting potential ambush points, and planned the safest route to move under cover of trees while avoiding the open terrain below. As night fell, they moved again, the forest providing the first real concealment they had since leaving the compound. Halle led them silently, navigating by the stars and the faint outline of distant ridges. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping branch, set her nerves on edge. Enemy patrols could be anywhere, and the journey was far from over. Yet for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. They were closer to safety, closer to the Allied forces waiting beyond the mountains. Hours later, Halle found a small hidden cave along the riverbed. She guided Mendez and Rains inside, securing the entrance with rocks and sparse foliage. Exhaustion finally caught up with them. Halle bandaged fresh abrasions, checked for infection, and allowed them to rest. The quiet of the cave was deceptive, but it gave them a momentary reprieve. Halle stayed awake, listening to the wind and distant noises, her mind planning the final approach to the border and the extraction point. By dawn, they resumed their trek, moving carefully through the forested slopes, following the natural contours of the land. Hale's knowledge of the terrain, her survival instincts, and her training allowed them to avoid enemy patrols and minimize exposure. Every step brought them closer to the safety of friendly territory, yet the danger remained palpable. Hale's focus never wavered. Any lapse could result in capture or worse. Finally, after 2 days of relentless movement, they reached a ridge overlooking a small outpost marked as Allied territory. Halle allowed herself a moment to breathe, scanning the area for patrols. The journey was not over, but the worst was behind them. The mountains, the ravine, and the treacherous desert terrain had tested them to the limit, but they had survived. Hale's mind shifted to the extraction plan, signaling the outpost without drawing enemy attention, ensuring her team's safe passage, and finally returning to a place where they could recover. As the sun rose higher, Hale whispered to Mendez and Rains, "We're close. Stay low. We make it out together." The team advanced cautiously toward the outpost, every movement deliberate, every sound accounted for. They were battered, wounded, and exhausted, but alive and closer than ever to safety. Hale's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the resolve that had carried them through mountains, ravines, and the shadow of death itself. Hale crouched at the edge of the ridge, scanning the outpost below. The friendly forces had established a perimeter, men moving with methodical efficiency, unaware of the danger that had stalked the mountains for 2 days. Mendez leaned against her side, sweat and grime streaked across his face, eyes wide with exhaustion. Rain's breathing was ragged, but he still clutched the small pack of supplies Hale had salvaged. They were within reach of safety, yet one wrong step could undo everything. Hale's mind ran like a high-speed engine, calculating timing, line of sight, and cover. The extraction point was a small clearing near the outpost's perimeter, visible only from the ridge above. Hale had scouted it days earlier, memorizing the placement of guard towers and patrol routes. She signaled Mendez and Rains to follow her lead, using hand gestures and whispers. Every step was deliberate, the team moving like shadows through the high grass. The ridge dropped sharply into the clearing. A miscalculation could result in a fall or exposure. Hale counted the distance in heartbeats, guiding her team through the descent with meticulous care. Enemy patrols were still active below, likely remnants of the forces left behind in the chaos of the compound's destruction. Hale's ears picked up the faint hum of engines in the distance, reconnaissance vehicles searching for any sign of survivors. Time was finite. If they moved too slowly, the outpost might be compromised before they arrived. If they moved too fast, they risked being spotted by the remaining enemy scouts. Hale's instincts screamed, a blend of training, survival, and raw determination, slow, steady, and precise. The final approach required crossing an open patch of scrubland for 30 meters, exposed to line of sight from multiple angles. Hale calculated the enemy's likely observation posts and the rotation of guards. She dug her heels into the dirt and whispered instructions. Low, fast, don't stop. If you hear a sound, hit the ground. Move when I move. Mendez nodded, Rains swallowed hard, and they followed her rhythm. The desert wind whipped against their faces, carrying the scent of dust, smoke, and pine from distant foothills. Hale counted heartbeats. On the third, they surged across the open area, bodies low, eyes scanning. Gunfire erupted behind them, tracer rounds whipping across the dirt, but they kept moving, propelled by sheer will. A bullet grazed the ridge above, spraying dust across Hale's face, but she did not falter. Mendez stumbled once, and Hale caught him, pushing him forward, forcing him to regain balance. Rain's hands shook on the pack, but he pressed on, driven by the same determination that had carried them this far. The clearing was nearly reached when a scout emerged from the trees below, spotting the trio. He raised his rifle, shouting a warning. Hale reacted instantly, raising her AK and firing a controlled burst. The scout crumpled into the grass, silence returning immediately after the sound of the gun. Hale's pulse raced, adrenaline slicing through exhaustion. "Move!" she hissed, dragging Mendez and guiding Rains. The remaining distance felt endless, every second a battle against fear, pain, and terrain. They reached the outer perimeter of the outpost, the friendly forces finally noticing them. Soldiers shouted, alarms blared briefly, but then recognition dawned. Hale waved her hand, signaling friend from foe. A few rapid movements and gestures, and the soldiers understood. They rushed to cover the wounded and provide immediate support. Hale allowed herself a fleeting moment of relief. Mendez and Rains were safe, the extraction complete, and the immediate threat neutralized. Yet the mission's psychological weight still pressed on her shoulders. Medical personnel assessed Mendez and Rains, stabilizing their injuries. Hale stood back, chest heaving, muscles screaming in protest, but her eyes were fixed on the ridge above. She knew the enemy could regroup, could attempt a counterstrike, yet for now, the threat had passed. Communication lines were established, reinforcements dispatched to secure the surrounding mountains, and aerial surveillance began scanning for any lingering enemy forces. Hale's mind did not relax. She had survived too many moments to assume safety prematurely. Command arrived, and Hale was debriefed on site. The leaders were astonished. Her account detailed the infiltration, destruction of the generals, and extraction of the hostages with precision and minimal collateral damage. Every tactical choice, every improvisation under pressure, was documented. The story of their survival would be studied in military academies. How one operative, against impossible odds, dismantled an entrenched enemy and led her team through life-threatening terrain to safety. Hale answered questions calmly, though the fire in her eyes betrayed the ordeal she had endured. Later, Hale walked through the camp, Mendez and Rains on either side, receiving congratulations and reassurances from fellow soldiers. She felt the weight of gratitude, relief, and exhaustion converge. Yet beneath it all lingered a quiet acknowledgement of the cost the fallen allies, the chaos left behind, the dark knowledge of violence necessary for survival. Hale did not celebrate. She understood the gravity of her actions. She had destroyed a command network, altered the balance of local power, and survived against incredible odds. The mission's success was undeniable, but it was not without shadows. In the evening, Hale sat near a small fire with Mendez and Rains. Words were few. Exhaustion silenced them. Rains broke the quiet, a weak smile crossing his face. "We wouldn't have made it without you," he said. Hale shook her head, eyes distant. "We made it because we had to," she replied. Silence returned, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Around them, the outpost buzzed with life and preparations for further missions. But for a few moments, there was peace. The mountains behind them, the desert ahead, and the knowledge that survival had been earned through blood, cunning, and unbreakable will. Night fell over the outpost, stars blazing overhead like witnesses to the impossible journey. Hale reflected on the mission, the compound, the mountains, the narrow escape, and the extraction. She thought of those lost, of the enemies defeated, of the fragile balance between vengeance and duty. And she understood something vital. Survival was more than endurance. It was calculated courage, decisive action, and the unwavering resolve to lead when no one else could. By dawn, Hale prepared for departure. Mendez and Rains were stable, receiving medical care, and the outpost had reinforced its perimeter. Command offered accolades, but Hale declined fanfare. Her mind was already on the next mission, the next objective, and the lessons carved into her body and soul from the past days. The mountains had tested them. The desert had tried to consume them. Yet they had emerged alive, intact, and victorious. Hale glanced at the horizon, the rising sun igniting the desert with gold and fire. She felt exhaustion deep in her bones, yet it was tempered by the satisfaction of survival and the knowledge of a mission completed against all odds. The mountains and ravines had yielded to her resolve. The enemy had fallen, and her team was alive. In the quiet morning, Hale allowed herself one deep breath, letting the weight of triumph and the scars of battle settle. The desert stretched endlessly before her, vast and unforgiving, but for now, she had conquered it. With one final glance back at the ridge that had tested every fiber of her being, Hale turned and walked toward the outpost, the safe path ahead guiding her steps. Mendez and Rains followed, their faith in her unspoken but absolute. Behind them lay destruction, survival, and the legacy of a mission that would not soon be forgotten. Ahead lay recovery, reflection, and the unyielding certainty that they had endured what few could. Hale's silhouette disappeared into the morning light, a warrior forged by impossible circumstances, unbroken and resolute.